Right. So, who am I? My name is Ozsvald. I've met some of you yesterday. It's very nice to be here. This is my first time traveling to Lithuania, and I'm very happy to be invited by IDIS and the organizing crew. So I'm an interim chief data scientist. This is a job title that I made up a couple of years ago. I've been creating my own career for 15 years now, and I keep trying to figure out what it is that I'm doing and why am I doing it, and so I keep coming up with new job titles. One of the problems in our field is rampant job title inflation. So people have 1 year of experience and they try to claim they're a senior person in data science or machine learning or whatever because those jobs pay better. And when I realized that I can make up my own job title because I run my own company, I decided, I'm chief. I'm clearly chief. So I'm chief data scientist. I'm the T-boy. I'm everything. But rather than claiming any job title in between, I thought, well, I can't be any bigger than the chief. So that's who I became. So I've been working in the field of data science and artificial intelligence for almost 20 years. I did my master's degree in 1998. I nearly did a PhD, and then I was tempted into the world of startups, and I worked in a startup on the university campus in Sussex University in the UK, down on the south coast. And I kept meaning to go back and do a PhD, but it turns out once you started earning some money, it's quite nice to keep earning some money, and then you buy a house and keep earning money, and then 20 years pass. Which also means that unlike many data scientists who graduated and had a PhD and knew math and knew what they were doing, some of us just make it up as we go along. So I've had 20 years of making it up as I go along. And I'm pretty proud of that because it turns out you have to be pragmatic and just figure out what's required in the environment around you. I'm also an author of O'Reilly's High Performance Python. I co-authored that with an American chap, Misha Gorolik, 5 years ago. We've just started working on the second edition to be published next year. O'Reilly are very kind to their authors, and they send boxes of books around for signing at conferences. So I have 20 copies of this book here to give away today, and we'll do that in the first coffee break. The volunteers out the front will do some kind of organization, so you don't need to leave a talk to come down for it. Just during the coffee break, once the coffee has started, we'll do the signing. There'll be 20 copies free to give away. I'll sign it for you, so you just have to come and queue up when the volunteers say that the queue is starting. I've also started to do video tutorials with Pluralsight. Does anyone know Pluralsight? Does that brand? Oh yeah. Oh wow. Lots of you. Oh, more than in my London user group. That's amazing. So I've got a video on Pluralsight published about 3 weeks ago now, introducing data science for engineers who are getting into the field and want to visualize their data, which is the theme of today's talk. And the thing that I'm most proud of is the PyData organization. I'm one of the co-founders of PyData London. Our London meetup is one of 140, and remember that number, it'll come important later on, one of 140 meetups around the world that's grown up in the last 7 or so years. We started 6 years ago. We were the first outside of the US, and we've now grown to the largest PyData on the planet and the largest data science, open source data science group on the planet for Python, with almost 10,000 members. We've got a huge membership in London, 200 people turning up every month. It's crazy and really good. So I'm really proud of this community that we built, and I'm really, really happy to see the community building up out here and the PyData track that you've got evolving here, and the other PyData organizers we have here. So today I'm going to tell some short stories on citizen science with Python, so doing good with our Pythonic and programming skills using data. I'm going to provide some tips for how you could do the same. And then there'll be a short live demo at the end to show some of the tools that we can use to do this. Before I start, I want to make sure I hope I'm pitching this at the right audience. How many of you identify as data scientists already? Put your hand up. Okay, and then put your hand up if you identify as software engineers. Yeah, okay, good, right. You're my main audience. Data scientists, sorry, you're going to have seen some of this before. The stories hopefully will be new to you, but the demo won't be. So the first story I'll tell is about the Macedonian air quality. So this was, now North Macedonia, I'm reminded. When I heard this story, it was still Macedonia. Under the negotiation with Greece, that was renamed to North Macedonia a year or so, 2 years ago. So I heard this story at Pi Data Amsterdam, so one of the Pi Data conferences held in Amsterdam by a chap called Gordon, and he was telling it when he's a bit older, but he was telling the story of when he was 21 years old. This was a few years back. And the air quality situation hasn't really changed, unfortunately, so this story is still incredibly relevant. So Gordon started programming when he was 21. And then this investigation comes out of that. And separate to that, he was aware, he had some awareness, like everyone, that the air quality wasn't very good. And this picture is not cloud that has come down into the city. This is pollution that has risen up and can't escape the city. And so every summer, the city fills up with pollution, and you can see, if you fly, you can see the tops of the buildings. But if you're on the ground, you can't see anything. And this is normal. This is known as the smelly fog, and it's a normal situation. No one is worried about this because, hey, it happens every year, right? It's just normal. The government says that it's okay. Gordon got some data and was trying to figure out what the data was telling him, and he couldn't understand that he was programming, how he couldn't normalize his data. It didn't seem to make sense. And the more he normalized it, the more he couldn't understand why he, as a junior programmer on his first good project, just couldn't make these numbers make sense. And it turns out the reason was that the data showed that the air pollution was 20 times the EU pollution limits and 4 times Beijing's pollution. And we know that Beijing's pollution is really bad. So this is crazy bad. And Gordon's sitting there saying, but my numbers, they're so big, it can't be possible. This is ridiculous. It turns out, no, it's the truth. That's the air that he's sitting in when he's coding away. It was really, really awful. And so this turned into a bit of a political movement. And so the interesting bit of this story is this is someone who's learning to program, ends up turning into a bit of a political activist. So initially, Gordon got a JSON data dump. And I asked at the end of his talk, why did you get a JSON data dump if the data was so bad for the pollution? Why the heck would the government publish the data? He said, well, one of the requirements of us coming into the EU is that the EU gave us some things, and some of the things they gave us were air pollution monitoring devices, but a requirement was we had to publish the data as open data. So the data was published, but it was undocumented. It wasn't meant for anyone to actually read it and do anything with it. And there was certainly no push from the government to highlight just how bad the data was. So Gordon took this data and then learned to program with it, realized just how bad the situation was. He made a website first of all, and then that became a mobile app, and it turned into a proper app over some time. But as he tells the story, 1 million people ended up being engaged in this when it got some publicity within a month. And then the news media started to run stories with it, and people started to realize that the smelly fog, this standard situation, was not normal, and it was not a good thing. The visualizations got printed out. That's a member of parliament on the right-hand side showing pictures in parliament from the app. And this led to intense discussion from the opposition party in government, saying, this is ridiculous, down with the main party, you should vote us in, we'll fix everything. And it got to the point that a minister in the government challenged Gordon that his app was in error, the data was wrong, it was all a lie, and it was bad. So Gordon counter-challenged back to the minister publicly, if you can demonstrate that the data is wrong, I will take everything down. However, if you challenge publicly and it turns out the data is right, you will resign. And as he tells it, the minister then didn't come back. So they've got a political movement going at this point. He's found other people. They're doing lots of publicity. They've got support in Parliament. And it ended up driving government policy. So it ended up becoming part of the election manifestos for both parties to clean up the air in the next election cycle, which is a pretty amazing outcome. Now, I did also follow up on what happened after that. And it turns out there was a change in government, the policy was changed, and then things kind of slowed down again, and things kind of went back to business as usual. But the population are much more aware now. There are more pollution monitors around, and people are more used to asking questions about this and challenging the government. And so there are many more people, citizen activists, using the data that comes out to popularised the idea that, hey, bad air kills people. It definitely kills. We've got a court case in the UK, in London at the moment, with a person who died, and there's a court case that determined if pollution can be determined to be the main cause of her death, and then that will possibly lead to suing the government afterwards. So that's a pretty big thing happening in the UK. And this is happening throughout Europe and around the world now. So it's good. We've finally figured out that bad air kills people, kills the plants, kills the environment, and it's bad and we shouldn't do it. And so I love the development of this story. A future piece that came out of this is they're now collaborating with the EU Space Agency to get satellite data to look for hotspots, so pollution hotspots, things that are messing up the air locally. Because it turns out there are a bunch of illegal polluters, including an ex-British waste pollution plant that many years ago was sold to Macedonia because it was illegal to run in the UK due to pollution limits, and it wasn't illegal in Macedonia. And so these things get highlighted and then fixed. So I really like this. So how would you start? Well, get a public data set. There's lots of public data in the EU. You're in the EU, so you can get some of this public data. You can get your own data set, of course, from your own company, your own academic institution, but there's lots of public data. Load it and investigate it. And the important thing to realize is most people, most of the population of this country, most of the population of the EU cannot access this data. They don't know what a CSV file is or what a JSON decoder looks like. They don't know how to draw a graph. And so if you do something and then you show it to someone who is an activist or an environmentalist, somebody who's interested, who doesn't have programming skills, you will have an amazing collaboration in no time, simply because you've got the keyboard skills. So you make some graphs, use matplotlib in Python or Plotly as a public plotting tool, and then you tell a story. And then let me say that again, this is the important bit. Get the data, figure out what's in it, and tell a story. And by telling a story, you will get other people to work with you and begin to cause change around you. So here's the second story, updating outdated medical results. This is a really nice one. So I heard about this, it was actually passed around the PyData organizers after Anna, and I'm going to butcher her name. No, actually, I can't butcher her name. Anna S. Anyone tell me how I would pronounce that name in Polish? Steiber? Stieber? Even that, I'm going to butcher it. Anna S. Anyway, I do not wish to make her name wrong. So Anna gave a 5-minute lightning talk, just like the lightning talks that we had here last night and we'll have tonight, talking about Friedman's curve. Who's familiar with Friedman's curve? Put your hand up. It's around childbirth. 1 hand, 2 hands. Okay. So the Friedman curve, developed in 1955, is around childbirth. So the curve was developed by measuring for a number of patients, a number of women going through childbirth, by Friedman and his team back in '55, about cervical dilation during the hours of birthing. So when the baby is going to come out, the cervix has to dilate. It takes about 6 to 12 hours, and then when it's the right size, the baby pops out. Birth's done, everyone's happy. Does it happen in a consistent way? Well, Friedman gathered the data to tell the first story and provide the first medical advice, and it has become the standard medical advice around the world. And this medical advice says there is one standard way that the baby comes out due to cervical dilation. Only, it turns out, there is not just one way that this works. So there are a set of stages of labor. The latent phase takes about 8 hours, and then there's an accelerated phase. The cervix dilates quickly at this point, and then things happen quite fast. If you're a midwife and you're monitoring one of your patients, if the cervix doesn't dilate on schedule, you have to make a call. Well, maybe there's a problem. And if there's a problem, maybe we have to intervene. So maybe we introduce drugs to make the cervix dilate and the birthing process speed up to fit the curve, because the curve is normal. Or maybe we need to go and do more. Maybe we need to have a cesarean operation, or maybe we have to do some kind of other intervention. But these are pretty big medical steps. They will have a negative impact upon both the mother and the child, and they're costly for the hospital as well. But we know we have to do these things because the data tells us from 1955 that this was the case. But it turns out 60 years have passed and lots of things have changed. Particularly back then, they had different drugs that they used. They often provided drugs to all mothers at the beginning to change the birthing process. They used forceps during delivery at least some of the time. That's generally not used anymore. And the women were of a different age and a different kind of health in general. So 60 years of education in the birthing process has changed the setup entirely. But we still follow this graph from 60, 70 years ago. And so Anna and her colleagues gathered new data to update these outdated results. What we see here is, so the red dotted line is the Friedman curve, and then we have the bar charts there, time along the bottom. So at 1 hour, for a number of subjects that were being measured against this bar chart, the cervical dilation was between 0 and 3 centimeters. And then by, say, 6 hours, most of the patients had a cervical dilation of between 5 and 10 centimeters, but those whiskers, the long bars, suggest there are some outliers. So it's still the case that at 5 or 6 hours, some people haven't really started their dilation process yet. But most of the women are in those bar charts above the red line. So most of them have their process occurring faster than the Friedman curve would suggest. Then we have that rapid change at around 9 hours. And those dots, those are individual instances of women who are still not going through the process as fast as everyone else. Everyone else has already gone to 10 centimeters, they've had their baby, and the process is over. So this tells us that the classic curve doesn't actually fit one real-life medical unit. And actually, this is one of many studies around the world, and they all show that the birthing process around the world does not match the standard Friedman curve. So what do we do with this? First of all, this highlights the problem. Then they did a tiny bit of machine learning, which is really sensible. They made a single decision tree. So for the data scientists in the room, this is not super advanced. This is not deep learning. This is a simple decision tree, a set of if-then rules. The top rule says, are you a mother who is having her first birth or second or subsequent births? It turns out the first birth takes longer, and then births 2, 3, 4 tend to happen quicker. If it's your first birth, you go down the left-hand side of the tree. And then if you are under a certain weight, you go further down the left, and if you are over a certain weight, you go down the right. That will affect the birthing time. And then age becomes a factor, and a few other factors come in. The really nice thing about this is they could sit down with midwives who have no programming skills at all, no data analysis skills, and work through some of these answers. And the midwife would say, yeah, sure, yeah, that completely makes sense. I see that. And of course they see that. This is the data they're gathering from their birthing unit. And so they're using this to begin to change the policy of how they deal with patients, and particularly how they make a decision about whether they need to go and do a bigger medical intervention, or whether actually, although the mother is not on the Friedman curve, the mother is inside the expectations for the data they've gathered, and so there are no problems occurring. So how would you start? And this can be in medical science, but this could be in your company, this could be in your academic institution, this could be with government-provided open data. So check for outdated assumptions. It turns out the world moves fairly quickly, and if you're using things from 70 years ago, maybe they're not true anymore. In your business, things probably changed in the last 5 years. If you've changed your customers and how you're making your products, things have probably changed. And yet probably people are still using the old methodology and the old data, the old assumptions, the old decision points. And maybe they're wrong. Maybe you can have quite a big impact by just questioning those old assumptions and getting a bit of data. So again, you gather your data and you visualize it. Make simple models. The number of people in data science who rush to make the next most complex model, it has to be TensorFlow and I need to use Apache Spark. No, almost always. All you need to do is get some data, put it on a USB stick, analyze it, draw a couple of graphs, and then put a few if-thens, else statements in there. And that will actually let you make the first big new decisions in a way that's entirely understandable and debuggable, and that all of your colleagues can communicate with you around. And then, yeah, you can build up iteratively as things improve. So now we've done a bit of personal health, we've done a bit of medical health. What about environmentalism? So a colleague of mine, Dirk Gorrison, back in London, super smart chap. He runs the London, or he was one of the co-founders of the London Machine Learning Meetup. He also works with a startup called Oxbotica. They do self-driving vehicles up in Oxford. He's long had an interest in autonomous vehicles, and it turns out prior to his work on autonomous cars, He was working with a charity trying to save orangutans, and this is Tanzania, I think, so down in the middle of Africa. And here's the challenge. You have orangutans that could be sold as pets, so you caged baby orangutans, and then they get abandoned at a certain point in their life when they get big. Or due to deforestation and farming, we end up with displacement. And so volunteers have to go in and rescue the orangutans. And that costs money, of course. These are financially driven organizations. They're typically charities. So these orangutans are rescued. And then when they're relocated and you release them, you want to make sure they're doing well. Have we done a good job? Have we just put them somewhere else where they die? And that will be a bad outcome. We want to make sure we put them somewhere where they live and they live a healthy, rescued, happy life. So they have to be relocated and tracked. How do you track an orangutan? Well, it doesn't have a neck like we do. It has a very fat neck, so you can't put a ring on it. You can't give it a watch. You can't attach anything to it. It's a very intelligent animal. It does not want things being attached to it. And so what you do is you take little micro transmitters and you put them under the skin. So you cut the skin open, pop one of these inside, and it lasts for several years. It turns out they're reasonably reliable. Dirk has a set of blog entries on this, and they're not actually super reliable. They tend to break quite quickly. Because they're small, they go under the skin, their range is not very long. And can someone tell me, if you're in the rainforest, what happens with radio waves and the rainforest? Say again? Muting, what do you mean by that? Yes, the range of signal is decreased. So the water interacts with radio waves, and when you've got thick canopies and lots of mist, your radio range is significantly reduced. When your device is tiny and the thing you're tracking is intelligent and very mobile, it's quite hard to track them. So the way you track them is the animal is released, and then a tracker, a human, has a radio beacon, has a range of 30, maybe 50 meters. They go to where they released the animal yesterday, and they see if it's still there today. And if it isn't, they go walking. And after a while, maybe the device starts beeping. It's not directional, so they just have to walk backwards and forwards until it beeps louder. And then they home in and they find the orangutan. Brilliant. They sleep. The next day they wake up, they listen to the device, it's not beeping, they start to walk again, and they go to try to find the orangutan. So they check for days, and then weeks, and then months to find this orangutan or other orangutans and see how they're developing. But that's a very manual process. Dirk asked the question, can we use drones on the right-hand side there to fly around and then spot the radio signals from these animals? So the answer is yes, kind of, and increasingly this is becoming more likely. So Dirk used the solution in the top right chart. You can see some software-defined radio signals. So software-defined radio is where you program a hardware device with adaptive frequencies to track the radio pings, and then use Python processing. So that's the SciPy signals module and others to understand this data. The drone takes off in the middle of the jungle, and it flies some kind of fixed search pattern, and there's no radio contact. It comes back to base and lands. Then you take the data off of it, and you figure out, based on the radio emissions that it's picked up, whether you found any of your signals. So it's post-processing, and you have no control over this. This is not a US military drone flown remotely by a pilot. This is a fully autonomous vehicle where if it disappears, it disappears. You have no control over it. So it comes back and it tells you where the search area should be. And I'll give you just an idea of what, if that is going to work. Let's just see. I don't know if you'll pick up the sound. That might be on my laptop. Well, if you're missing the sound, imagine it going bzzz, because all it is a drone taking off. So this is a drone taking off. You can see Dirk just at the building at the top there looking up. He's not controlling it. And now he's walking away because this thing's on its autonomous flight path. We've got a camera hanging down. And in a moment, it will turn around a bit and then fly off. And this is one of the test flights. So it's programmed to fly autonomously. It's quite a big unit. It's about this big, sort of fairly deep. And it's only got enough batteries and sensor power to get about sort of 30, 40 meters of coverage. So it flies around a little bit. And then it goes off. And then this one here, it's a 4-minute test flight. So it flies into the jungle, and then it flies back, and then it lands. And just to prove that it can land. So by then it's come back, and then it's going back down again, and it lands. So you just get the idea that this thing runs autonomously. So the first time Dirk does this, they send off one of their units. They've done loads of testing. He's been testing it in the UK. They send off one of these units. It flies off. Amazing. Great. And they're waiting in the jungle. They're waiting, and they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they're waiting. And then it should have come back, and they're waiting, and they're waiting. And then this thing doesn't come back. And then they sit back and go, right, that was the first test flight. We have no remote control. We have no telemetry. The thing has gone. And they have to go home. And that's it. So he flies back to the UK. It's pretty disappointing. Amazingly disappointing, right? The big drone, they've lost it. It turns out when you set the flight path, it flies back and forth. That assumes there are no obstructions. What Dirk hadn't realized was there was a point of elevation where there was a small hill and the trees were a bit higher. And you want to fly as low as you can to maximize your signal quality that you'll get to get the widest coverage, and they hit a tree. And then somebody found this unit, one of the local people found the unit, photographed it and sent it back broken. So very unfortunate. A year later, they go back and do another test. And then the second test, this was 6 months ago, succeeded. So they actually ran their test back and forth, and that plot in the bottom right-hand corner is the track of another animal after post-processing that this unit had picked up. So now they can more efficiently allocate where humans need to go, or the beginnings of the project, allocating where the humans need to go to more intensively and accurately track where these orangutans are to improve their post-relocation care and survival. And assuming this works, you could imagine scaling up the operation, saving more animals, putting more money into this kind of monitoring project. So this was a really nice story of doing good with your data. So, automate a manual process. I would not suggest starting with drones. Drones are really expensive, complicated, they break. Dirk has horrible stories about trying to get rechargeable batteries into Africa through customs, and then you turn up and you realize you've got the wrong antenna module and everything's wasted, and you have to go back and get the right module, and then the leg breaks off of the thing and the unit's broken again. So don't start with drones, that's really complicated. But start with something simpler, automate some kind of process, collect your data, visualize it, and make your decisions. So here's the final short story. This is a hackathon I was involved in 1 month ago around improving political engagement. You know, in the UK, we have our ridiculous Brexit situation where half the country thinks we need to leave the EU and half the country, including me, thinks we need to stay in the EU. And there's lots of miscommunication, there's lots of foolishness. It's a real mess right now. One of the big problems is most of the populace has become disengaged from the political process. And as a consequence, if I choose not to vote, then somebody else chooses what will happen for me. And that's no good. We want more people to be choosing to vote themselves. And I realize that it's your election day as well. So for those of you who have not yet chosen to vote, remember that you do not want somebody else choosing what your future will be like. You want to choose what your future will be like. So in lunchtime, go and vote. Exercise your democratic vote. So this is me amplifying the effect of my hackathon from a month ago. So the question we asked, and I was just one of the attendees at this event, the question the organisers were asking was, can we get more people registered to vote for the EU election? So in the UK, it's about 34% of the eligible population will choose to vote, so only 1/3. In our general elections for politics, it's 2/3, but for the EU elections, only 1/3. So can we get more people registered to vote? Can we, using open data only, so aggregated mass data, not individual data, find people who are more likely to have pro-EU sympathies, who are more likely to be not registered to vote, and then advertise at them on social media to say, hey, you really should vote, with some kind of targeted messaging. The group organising this had loads of different campaigns. They had WhatsApp systems, they had surveys, Facebook integration, sending good stories around, telling people why it's worth getting involved in the political process. My job wasn't to worry about that. My job was to lead a team of data scientists at the hackathon to figure out where we might put up, which kind of areas of the country put up these politically targeted adverts to say, you should vote. Not who you should vote for, but simply, you should vote. So we got open data from the British government. So the second chart shows the turnout in the 2015 general election, so one of our government elections in the UK. And we see our turnouts, it's percentage. There's a chart at the bottom, it says 60 and 70. So between 55 and 75% of people in different regions of the country were turning out to vote. So some of those regions had very low attendance at voting. So lots of people not bothering to vote. Maybe we can engage those people. And the third chart shows for the same regions the percentage of women aged 30 to 45. According to the surveys done elsewhere in this group, women aged 30 to 45 were more likely to have a pro-EU inclination, so more interested in EU integration than perhaps an older age group where there's less interest. So if we target areas that have a low turnout in the election and a higher proportion of women in this particular demographic, we're likely to get more people to register to vote who could be against the EU and for the EU, but probably, hopefully, fingers crossed, more likely to be pro-EU. But more importantly, getting more people registered to vote. That's the important thing, getting more people to get out and exercise their vote. And then how do we make this complex decision of, well, we've got many regions on the country and many possible ways of deciding which areas to target? Well, we put it on a scatter chart. That was the easiest thing we could do. So a square scatter chart, it's a bit elongated there. All those dots represent one region of the UK. If you're higher up the chart, that means there was a greater turnout at the last election. If you're lower on the chart, then it means there's a lower turnout. And if you're more to the right, then it means there are more women in the target demographic who are more likely to vote pro-EU. So we then took, with an if-then rule, a couple of the dots in the bottom right-hand corner, and then they ran an ad campaign off of that. And this is the kind of thing where we can't test what the output is. We can't do an A/B test to see how well this would have worked. We don't know. The elections are this weekend. In the UK, they happened on Thursday. So we don't know what the outcome was, but I and a bunch of colleagues used data to try to improve the political engagement process, and we were in a group of about 100 people who were working to improve political engagement in general via lots of different mechanisms. So I feel that I did my little bit there to try to make the world a slightly better place. So I'm very happy with that. And you can too. So let's do a short demo. So this is a demo of a different topic entirely. We're going to use a Jupyter Notebook. The data scientists will know this. The rest of you, hopefully, will see something a little bit new in here with Jupyter Notebooks and pandas and seaborn graphing. The Guardian is a big newspaper in the UK. It's a very big liberal newspaper. They put out lots of stories and they spot things that are going wrong in the world. And they generally do a pretty good job. But the Guardian, well, all newspapers make mistakes. A news article came out by this chap, Tom Forth, noted this article. The Guardian saying there is a collapse in craft beer manufacturing. I mean, this is a crisis, right? We've had a boom in craft beer manufacturing in the UK. Now there's a collapse because big companies are muscling in and wiping out the small companies. 8 new breweries opened in the last year, according to The Guardian, down from 390 the year before. So this sounds like a massive collapse in the craft beer brewing scene. And this is terrible. Tom Forth works with the Open Data Institute, so he's used to using open data, and he uses some Power BI to load in some open government data and says, hang on a minute, these numbers don't make sense, so I don't think this is correct. So we're going to do something slightly more involved, recreating that. So this is a Jupyter Notebook. I've embedded the image of the story we're dealing with. In Brixton, that's not very far from where I live. And there's lots of craft beer in the UK. I know there's lots of craft beer. I enjoy it. So, can we download the data from the government website? CSV file, yes, of course we can. Tidy it up and do a couple of graphs. So I download the data, and I get here 4.3 million rows of CSV data. So that loads in a couple of seconds. So 4 million rows, not big data. It's 2 gigabytes, I think, but it fits into RAM, so it's not big data, it's small data. If it fits into your RAM, it's small data. That's all you need. 2 gig, it's fine. We look at the rows of data with the head command. I've got 55 columns, so lots of rich data in here about companies, particularly the year they were registered in, or actually the dates they were registered. So I do a bit of cleaning up. These are examples of industry codes counted by popularity. So I don't know about the industry codes. I want to find the beer-related industry codes. So I do a bit of investigation. So there's other business activities, management consultancy, information technology, and somewhere in this list, at a much smaller frequency, will be the beer-related ones. And so I can pull out the beer ones, and it turns out there's this 11050 manufacturer of beer. This is the one that Tom used in his analysis. So I use a data frame query to pull out this particular code that I'm interested in, and it pulls me out 2,200 rows. And these are examples of the companies that are registered and their incorporation dates. So we know the dates that these companies were registered. So we can check to see if there's been a collapse recently. So if we show a count of incorporations from 2000 to 2018, I'll make that a bit bigger, then we get this. So 2000, bottom left-hand corner, there's a small number, but a positive number of new beer manufacturing corporations registered. And then by 2011, we see a big jump up. And then by 2018, the number's huge. It's just over 300 per year. And that's for 2 years running. And then in 2019, we see this strange drop-off. Why do we see a small count in 2019 at the moment? Because it's 2019, yeah, right. And I'm sure the Guardian didn't do that. That would be ridiculous. And the Guardian, one of the problems with the Guardian article is they don't quote their data sources. So we don't know why or how they came up with their conclusions. They don't quote their data. Here we've got open data. We can point at it and say, look, this is pretty obvious, right? At least it looks pretty obvious to us. So we can estimate, if it's only been 4 months of the year and we've got a certain count, we can estimate that times by 3, this will be the estimated count for 2019's registrations. It looks the same as 2017, 2018. So I'm not seeing evidence of a massive drop-off. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been a significant overnight change in behavior, of course. And this is where Tom's analysis finished. And I sat back and thought, yeah, but what would be another bit of evidence behind all of this? And then, of course, I hear you all ask me, Ian, after the 2008 global economic crisis, wasn't it the case that in the UK we saw a dramatic change in the registration of new businesses? Wasn't it the case that after many people were put out of work, they started their own new companies? And indeed, that's true. So what if we're seeing just an outcome of that effect? So if we look at all of the registrations of companies, not just the beer-related ones, then we see this up and to the right, massive magic growth curve. This is what startup founders desire to have in their businesses. But this is the growth of new companies in the UK from the 1950s. And in the bottom right-hand corner, down around here, we've got 2000 to 2010. That's when the global economic crisis occurred. And we see some wobbly behavior in new business formation. And then just after it, it shoots up and to the right. This is crazy. There's loads of new businesses being registered. And this is known in the UK. The Bank of England has published reports saying that, yes, after the global economic crisis, many people came out of large organizations and started new, smaller organizations. And there were many failures as well, of course. Many of these churn and die very quickly. But there are lots of new businesses being formed and a new business dynamic occurring in the UK. So what if that growth chart we saw a moment ago was simply a reflection of the growth in new business registrations? So a way to test that is to get a ratio of every year how many companies are registered and how many beer-related companies are registered. If the beer-related ones are more every year relative to the growth in companies, we would see a positive ratio growing over the years. But if every year the same number of beer companies were registered as a proportion to the number of new companies, we just see a flat line. So what do we see? We see a positive growth line. So that blue jagged line is the ratio of new beer companies to all companies, and it goes up and to the right. The green line, the wiggly one, is a smooth moving average that I used in pandas. And then that straight line just shows that, yes, there's a positive inclination from the 1980s, but particularly around here. So this is after 2010, and it jumps up again. So this is after the global economic crisis. So I would argue that what we're seeing here is a sustained trend going on over 40 years for new beer manufacturing companies to be increasingly registered every year relative to new business formation in the country. So it might be the case that in the last 6 months, we've seen a massive turnaround, significant drop-off, and everything has finished. But it seems unlikely if you've got a 40-year trend behind something that it turns around overnight. So I think this adds extra evidence to the argument that perhaps The Guardian has reported the wrong thing here. And that was easily developed using some open data. And this is something you could do too. So let's finish up. The main story, I hope you've got that from this, is that you should tell useful data stories. You have a power for good, you have the power of programming. Most people in the country don't have that. You can get some data and do something with it. You can make yourself famous within your company and enhance your career by doing this, and you can do it in the wider world. And either way, you'll be making things better. So tell useful data stories. When I was talking to Idis last night, and I was talking about the number of PyData meetups we have around the world, he said, well, there isn't one here. And so I thought it was worth asking the question, where's PyData Vilnius? Would anyone be interested in starting one of those? And maybe some of you would. And so, as Robertus announced earlier, at lunchtime, we'll do a data consultation. I don't know what to call it. At lunchtime, some of us who do data science will sit down on a table, hopefully we'll mark it. And for any of you who have got questions around your data and what you want to do with it, come and join us and talk. And if you can't talk to us, talk to your neighbor and see what you can do with your data, which tools you might need to answer the kind of question you've got. Talk about the questions that you've got that you haven't thought about how you want to answer yet. So if you're interested in talking about that, we'll just do that at lunchtime. We'll get a table reserved.